That's great.
I'm just going to try and swap my screen, sorry, so I can look at the camera. No. Okay, maybe not. Are you still seeing the correct screen? Okay. Right, you'll just have to excuse me for now viewing the side of my head for 20 minutes. So thank you very much for having me. I am James Walker. I'm the Hydrogen Development Manager at Emec. That's the European Marine Energy Centre. And I'm going to talk this evening through, so the programme says the Orkney Hydrogen Project, but in fact I'm going to talk about a number of hydrogen projects that I've lost count of. We're very active in hydrogen, and we're essentially living the confusion and the uncertainty that Paul's described there. We're tackling a lot of different aspects of the hydrogen economy and the hydrogen story. So I'm going to try and talk through a few of those to hopefully spark some discussion. So I thought, first of all, I ought really to introduce Emec and describe why we're talking about Orkney and how this all fits together, really. So I mentioned there Emec is the European Marine Energy Centre, and that's what you can see along the top here, the first four images. Those are marine energy devices. So that's a combination of tidal energy devices and wave energy devices. So devices that are intended to extract power from those two climatic areas, I suppose, or features of our climate. And we, Emec, were set up in 2003 up here in Orkney, which is, as you can imagine, very wavy and very tidally plentiful area of the world in 2003. And we were set up with the intention of producing or generating a essentially global scale of research and development excellence in marine energy for the UK and to be honest, for Europe, hence the name. And we've been involved in testing a wide range of these devices that you see here for a number of developers based in the UK and further afield. But in the meantime, we've broadened out a little and taken in a few other energy system segments or energy technology groups. And that's what I'm here to talk to you about tonight. So the second row of pictures is a very quick romp through some of our hydrogen related activities. So I'm obviously going to talk about those in more detail, so I won't dwell on those. But then in the meantime, we're also now involved in just about anything that's energy that involves water. So that's where you see these are floating wind turbines, which are hopefully going to play a big role in the Scottish energy system in the future. We're also quite heavily involved at the moment in the maritime area. So trying to understand how we might transition in shipping, which is a fairly key industry globally, of course, but in particular for island areas. So it's a key priority for us. This is an image of a hydrogen storage system on the seabed, and we see that as a potential future avenue that we're quite well placed to look at. So essentially what I'm trying to make clear here is that we're doing just about anything that involves water, really. And thankfully, hydrogen is made from water. So there is actually a relatively natural reason for including hydrogen in this mix. I use this slide when I'm talking to people elsewhere in the world, or at least in the UK. So I would expect the majority of people listening in Aberdeen know where Orkney is, but just in case, Orkney is here at the top of Scotland. I like to be clear and upfront about the fact that I'm based in Glasgow. So just in case there are any Orcadians in the audience who I offend by mispronouncing anything, that's my excuse. So I've talked through what we do. This is really why we do it. So at Emec, we have the delivery of the future net zero energy system as our vision and as our be all and end all, the goal that we strive towards all the time. And essentially we see a need for, following on from Paul's excellent summary of why hydrogen has a role in the energy system, we see a need for going out and showing what that might look like. So working to develop projects that will tick off some of these orange words. So we're really keen on reducing time, costs and risk associated with new energy technologies. And we think that one of the best ways to do that is by learning by doing. So by actually installing devices and testing them and understanding how they work in real world conditions. And that is where we have come up with this tagline for Orkney and Emec's activities, where we've developed a living lab. And that's basically what I'm here to talk to you about tonight, really. So because we're pushing boundaries and we're working with new technologies, we do find that we rub up against the regulatory envelope. So we tend to want to do things that aren't allowed yet. And that can be quite a key aspect of our work, is understanding where the current systems are perhaps restricting innovation, and seeing how we can safely push that barrier and try and test things slightly at the edge of comfort zones, just to understand how things work in practice. And we try very much to use that work to influence standards. So ensuring that we can account for how the work that we do could be and will be replicated elsewhere. But also fundamentally, health and safety is at the very core of everything we do. And I think that's so important, particularly when talking about hydrogen, because people naturally have health and safety related concerns about the use of hydrogen in different contexts. So we are living proof that you can work with hydrogen safely in an energy context. So similarly, just still further setting the scene a little, I think it's worth explaining why we're talking about hydrogen and why we're talking about hydrogen in the context of Orkney. So this graph here is showing, on the left, we have the demand that we see for power in the Orkney area, and on the right, we see the generation profile that we can expect in Orkney. So I won't bother too much about this, but it's worth pointing out the light blue here is the power demand on a deep, dark, cold winter, probably afternoon, when everybody turns the kettle on at the same time. So you can see that there is a significant differential between the peak demand that we might expect to see for power and the capacity that there is in Orkney to generate power. So that's really as a result of very, very enthusiastic wind turbine deployment in and around Orkney, and very keen use of the weather resources available, as well as our own marine energy activities. You see that we just can't use all the power that we're producing. And that initially in 2016 motivated my colleagues to have a look at hydrogen, because hydrogen offers, as Paul mentioned, the possibility of storing some of that power essentially. So if you make the hydrogen using an electrolyzer and you can store that, that's one way of capturing some of that electricity that would otherwise be wasted. So that's a key aspect of how we got involved in hydrogen. But then once you've made it, you really need to come up with something to do with it. So that's when you turn to, again, Paul very kindly touched on all this, so I don't need to dwell on it too much, but you can pick, I think, 5 key or particular applications for hydrogen in the broader energy system when you're thinking about how we try to deliver that energy decarbonisation journey that we need to go on. We don't have a gas network in Orkney, and on that basis, it's quite difficult to foresee the use for hydrogen domestic heating. But we are looking at developing these 3 other aspects. So the heavy duty transport area, so whether that is road vehicles like the buses and the trains, or whether in our case, to be honest, that's more looking at the maritime application, so ferries and planes. Whether you try and take in industry, in our case, you can no doubt imagine that Orkney is not a focus point of UK industry, but we have a few applications that we've been chipping away at. So I'll talk to you a little bit about that. And then also this important area following on from the power system context I've described, where you really look at hydrogen as a means of storing and transporting renewably produced power that you just can't stick down cables. So that's the context. Finally, in terms of context, I thought it would be remiss of me to speak to an audience in Aberdeen and not recognise the parallels between what's been happening in Orkney and in Aberdeen, and the areas where we align and the areas where there are some differences. And it occurred to me that I could open this with a Shakespeare quote and refer to the notion from Romeo and Juliet of 2 houses which are alike in dignity. I feel that's maybe a bit overconfident, speaking about a small island area with 20,000 people relative to a internationally regarded city as a centre of expertise in energy, but I'm going with it anyway. We both are representing areas that have an outsized impact in terms of energy, so I feel comfortable with the comparison. I think in Orkney, as I've described, the story for hydrogen really began as a means of trying to store excess, essentially, renewable power. I think in Aberdeen, it's almost the opposite. It was very much bottom up, coming with an application in mind, and then working back to how you, not necessarily all yourselves, but how the city council, let's say, or the transport authority are actually going to secure the hydrogen supply. I think, you know, they're getting there with that now, which is great. But both these aspects, drawing on innovation funding and international collaboration and really moving the sector forward, I would like to say, on behalf of Orkney, and I would like to tip my hat to those in Aberdeen who've really moved hydrogen transport forward. And I guess we're going to hear a bit more about that next as well. We also are talking about two areas with significant ambition for hydrogen. So following on from these early activities, there's a clear plan for what's to follow. And I think there are good parallels in terms of the reasons or the approach that the hydrogen activity is being undertaken with. This will perhaps be a controversial point, but I would like to think that hydrogen activity in both places is being undertaken with the delivery of net zero energy systems in mind. But there is a significant and I think compelling economic argument for developing hydrogen. So in Orkney, that's very much looking at resilience. So that's recognizing that there's an awful lot of fuel poverty in Orkney. It's an area of significant net import of fuels, such as heavy fuel oil for producing domestic heat. And actually, hydrogen offers an opportunity to make that fuel locally. So this is way down the line. This is not what we're working on at the moment necessarily, but you could foresee a future where places like Orkney can make their own fuel. And that's, I think, really quite compelling. I recognise the context is a bit different in Aberdeen. It's more about looking at how you retain the skills from the industry that's been developed in order to deliver a just transition. I think that personally, I think that's very important, and I think that's something that the hydrogen sector is really going to benefit from. So I'm really comfortable with that myself. I guess we'll perhaps talk about that a bit in the discussion. So that's context set aside. In terms of our hydrogen activities, I wanted to run through the main buckets for these first before I then focus on a couple in a bit more detail. So I mentioned that we have been making hydrogen from renewable power. So we have had an electrolyzer on one of our test sites in Orkney, and we have been powering that with a combination of tidal power generated off the test site. So this is essentially experimental tidal power. So we have developers bring these devices for test, and we benefit from the power, which is an ideal relationship, I would say. And then we've also have access to community wind turbines that would otherwise be heavily curtailed. So we're soaking up a lot of that would be excess power and producing hydrogen. I'll come on to the logistics aspects in a bit more detail in the next, I think it's the next slide, maybe the one following, but there is a dynamic where once you've made that hydrogen, you need to get it somewhere usually in order to have it used. So we've developed a bit of infrastructure really and some know-how in terms of how you store and transport hydrogen safely and efficiently. We've also been involved in the refueling side of things. So this is a picture of a truck that we commissioned for an aviation project we're involved with called High Flyer. So that's a mobile hydrogen refueling station essentially, and it's really cool bit of kit, to be honest. And then setting aside, we'll come back to the logistics bit because there's quite a lot of interest there, but once we've made and transported that hydrogen, we really need to think about how we're going to use it. And I think that's where we see a good amount of value in the activity that we've been undertaking in Orkney, where we've had the luxury really, or the honour of testing a fairly wide range of hydrogen applications and being able to say which work really well, which are quite challenging, which have really delivered in the energy system, which are exciting, to be honest. So we've covered heavy duty transport, well, both unheavy duty and on the heavier side, in particular in the ferries and airplanes. We've also looked at industrial heat. I mentioned this is the Orkney Distillery, which I'll come on to talk about, and we've looked at a project there. And we've also provided power to one of the ferries as it is at the dock in Kirkwall, which is an important aspect when you think about Paul's suggestion about the importance of air quality in the feasibility for hydrogen-based applications or business cases. When ferries are in harbour and are using their engines and emitting all sorts of pollutants in the town, that's not ideal. So that's quite an exciting application that we've been able to tackle as well. So on the production and the storage side, I wanted to just touch on two big, really big, exciting collaborative projects that we've been involved in. So these are, it's sort of one and then two. Surf and Turf was originally funded by the Scottish Government, was led by Community Energy Scotland with our involvement. And then that seeded what was called Big Hit, and that was a European Union project with a whole host of partners from across the Union. And those two projects combined created this, what I would call the Orkney hydrogen economy, or the Orkney hydrogen story, or the ins and outs of where we make the hydrogen and why and how and where it goes. So this is our main hydrogen production site on the Isle of Ely. And here we have, I mentioned the tidal turbines, the wind turbines, we have an electrolyser, we store the hydrogen, and then we stick it on these trailers and transport it by ferry to the Orkney mainland, to Kirkwall, where I mentioned we have the harbour side fuel cell. We've also got these vans that I skipped over in the last slide. And we also, so we have the potential within this project to supply power to the ferries, as I mentioned in the last slide. We also have the potential in the future to be looking at providing power, well, hydrogen as fuel for the propulsive power required for the ferries. So this is the Orkney hydrogen economy as it stands. I think that this dotted orange line is summarizing an awful lot of activity that was really important and necessary, and to be honest, a bit boring in terms of understanding how we work with the ferry operator and the relevant safety authorities to ensure that we can take hydrogen on board the ferries safely, and that we can do so in a manner that keeps everyone happy and confident. So that was an awful lot of work undertaken to make that happen. I think it's worth mentioning that. But looking towards the future, we have please excuse the crudeness of the images, but I hope this communicates something anyway. This is our site up in Edy where we make the hydrogen. This is the electrolyser and compressor, and wind turbine and tidal turbine. So we have another electrolyser due to come to the site later in the year, and we've also been really fortunate to receive some further government support to work with a battery developer based in Livingston to install a series of batteries on the site. So what we're looking at doing is charging the batteries using tidal power. So when the tide is high, we charge the battery. When the tide is low, we discharge the battery, and using that battery to control the power that we supply to the electrolyzers. And that's a relatively complex energy system then that's emerging, and that's a relatively exciting use of a battery. And I think what we're trying to do here really is show what the future could look like and show how these different technologies can work together to deliver that decarbonized system. So that's all quite exciting. Then I just wanted to come back to a couple of the use case examples that I've mentioned or that I've glossed over or skipped over. So this is a really important project that's quite an interesting one, I think. So I've mentioned, I hope, that the maritime application is really important in the island environment. We need to get people between the islands, we need to get supplies to and from the islands, but the ferries also consume a ridiculous amount of diesel, and it is not good for the local environment, far less emissions. So this is a really key focus area for folks in Orkney, and is therefore a project that we've been really keen to have been involved in this case. So this is looking at a hydrogen diesel hybrid engine where you supply 50-50 of each fuel. So you're immediately reducing diesel use on board this vessel by 50%. But the key thing here is that this is a retrofit solution, so you can apply this to existing vessels. This doesn't have to wait for the future procurement of extortionately expensive ferries. So this is a promising area, I think. But this project in particular, I've mentioned this a couple of times, has had significant challenges with regulation. So the regulation and the safety standards that are in place have restricted the activity in the project because of concerns around the use of hydrogen on board a vessel with passengers. So we're now going to have to test the vessel in harbour, which is a bit disappointing, but hopefully the step forward that we need to then get a vessel in commercial operation, basically running on hydrogen. And I think the key thing I wanted to emphasize there is the importance of learning from the journey rather than necessarily the destination. I think the Aberdeen experience with the buses actually is similar. I think the early deployment of those, although it seems like it was relatively straightforward by comparison to what I've described there, I guess the need to learn from early projects is clear, I hope. And this is key to delivering the future that we all envisage. So that's the maritime. I mentioned briefly the distillery project. This one's always very popular, so I felt like I ought to include it. It's also a personal favourite of mine. So we've just recently delivered a feasibility study looking at the use of hydrogen in the distillery. So this is a fairly standard distillery boiler. Apparently, I'm not an expert, but I believe, and we've looked at a solution that would retrofit a boiler so that it could run either on the kerosene or LPG and hydrogen. So it's similar to the ferry in that sense. We're looking at a hybrid to reduce the risk associated with the project. And we will hopefully use the boiler to provide heat for the distilling process. So we're moving forward to demonstrate that practically, hopefully. And that's a key one. Please keep an eye out for further on that and the opportunity for the first hydrogen fueled dram in the future. And then just very briefly, I was going to mention the fact that we're also now, as Emec and actually as the wider Orkney community, there's other organisations involved in these types of projects too. We're now working in collaborative European projects where we look outwards. So we work with partners of all sorts of places all over the continent, particularly islands, but not exclusively, to see how we might translate what we've been up to in Orkney, understand what we've learned, and how we might apply that in other cases and in other systems. So that's all really exciting and hopefully showing a legacy for the work that we've been undertaking. So I'll wrap up by saying that the key things that we've learned through our projects are as such. So I think I've hopefully demonstrated to some extent the value of this learning by doing idea. So the next step beyond some of the more fundamental research is really just to get some machines up and running and understand how they work in practice and what it's like actually delivering some of these services using hydrogen, for example, in this case. But that we've rubbed up against regulation in doing so. So we hopefully are making a case as regularly as possible for the need for regulation, particularly in energy decarbonisation, to move with the results that we're seeing. I've highlighted a couple of times the value of the hybrid solutions that we've been developing as a means to take us on the journey. So as a means to make the first steps and make these early projects easier to deliver by ensuring that we have the backup really of the non-hydrogen alternative. And what I've tried to do in talking about the maritime project in particular and the transport context in Orkney as well is to focus in on the need to look at local applications and local priorities and to rank which are the most challenging sectors or applications to decarbonize, and therefore which is the likely best role for hydrogen. So that's me. This is just a very final slide, which we can perhaps come back to because I'm way over time now, to say that we are on a journey in Orkney and we are scaling up hydrogen and hydrogen ambition, and we're looking forward to the future really and the next steps. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you again for having me, and also thank you to all these various organisations that we work with on all these projects.